Welcome back to History H114, History of Western Civilization 2. This is the second lecture for week 1. And if you have been looking at the syllabus, you should immediately be saying, well, wait a minute, what do you mean the second lecture for week 1? Because according to the syllabus, there's only one lecture. What are we doing here? And we've already seen that lecture. So why are we adding another lecture for week 1? Well, the short answer to this is because this lecture does deal with what it is we are doing here. So in many ways, it is just a continuation of that first part of the first lecture. What are we doing here? Because in this lecture, that has the general title for this part of it, as the Crumbling of Christendom, what I hope to do is to set the stage, so to speak. To set the stage for when the course actually begins with the emergence of early modern Europe and modernity. And to do that, we need to go back and look at what came before. Because if we want to see what is different and new, we have to know what, at least somewhat, what was new about it. And so often, especially dealing with modernity and the emergence of early modern Europe, scholars and the general populace as such look back and they have an incorrect view of what came before. So they see things as being new and different when they actually weren't at all. So this is part of setting the stage so that we can see the true newness and developments and organizations that takes place during the course of the 16th century and on into the 17th century for discerning what is different between medieval Europe and then eventually early modern Europe. Historical periodization is always a problem. Traditionally, we have ancient Europe, the ancient world, then we have the Middle Ages, and then early modern Europe or early modernity, and then modern history, modernity. And we have not come up with a good term yet for what comes after modern Europe. And I'll be talking about that in the last lecture of this course very well. But these general categories of periodization, when do they start? When do they begin? Now, scholars have debated those things for quite a while. The Middle Ages. It's not as someone woke up one day, went out and got the morning paper, and the headlines were, Medieval Europe begins today, or Early Modern Europe has emerged. Not possible, not part of it. What we can say in terms of this course is that Europe in 1300 was significantly different from Europe in 1600. It was even significantly different from Europe in 1555. And why I mentioned that date, we'll be seeing in the course of the next lecture for week 2 on the Reformation. But exactly when that change begins, and when can we say what had been, in a general sense, described as medieval is now early modern. Now, these terms, too, medieval, early modern, are designations that later scholars have applied to a series of developments. And scholars still can debate in terms of chronologically, when should we refer to the Middle Ages ending and when do we have to start talking about early modern Europe? They did not exist in the sources. Now, the term medieval did exist in the sources, at least in the later 15th or later 14th on to the 15th century. Italian humanists talked about how they were doing something different and new. They were recovering antique culture, the culture of Greece and Rome. And what had come between themselves here in the 15th century and antiquity, Greece and Rome, was simply one long, dark Middle Age, medium aevum in Latin, and that is the origins of our term medieval. But then historians took those scholars' view of themselves and accepted that as indicating the historical developments as such. So often we'll talk about, scholars have talked about the beginnings of early modern Europe as being found in the Renaissance and then the Reformation. There is some legitimacy to that, but so often that is read backwards. And the humanists, the Italian humanists of the 15th century, who viewed themselves as doing something new, actually weren't doing something all that new at all. There were some differences, yes, but there had been a devotion and a love for the classics all throughout what we now call the medieval period. And just an indication of that they weren't completely aware of what was going on, they also created a new way of writing. We're talking about this the development of the printing press and handwriting, a new script, which was called the humanist script. And they copied, or I should say, they thought they were copying Roman script, a way of Roman writing called Roman uncial. But actually, what they were doing was copying a medieval script, the Carolingian minuscule, actually. And so they were thinking that, oh, this is ancient, where it was actually 8th, 9th century script that they were using as the model for their so-called humanist script. So it's very problematic to go back and to identify some clear point of demarcation between medieval and the emergence of early modernity, between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. If you have taken History 113, you know from my lectures and work that the problem of the so-called fall of Rome is one that is or was created by historians. There was no time in the past where people at the time said Rome fell. We said, well, the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed in 476 BCE, oh, excuse me, CE, Romulus Augustulus, and that was the fall of Rome. And yet, to the Germanic chieftains at the time and the king of the Franks, Clovis, the emperor was still there in the east, and Clovis viewed himself as ruling for the emperor. There was no such thing as the fall of Rome. In 1453, there was the fall of Constantinople, which was the capital of the eastern part of the empire. It was fell to the Islamic invaders, to the so-called Turks at the time. They called them the Turks. They were not from Turkey, but they were the part of Islam. And that was a major factor in the West, but it did not as such indicate a doorway into a new era. So the fall of Rome is problematic when we go back and actually look at the historical sources and how what the documents are that we have, the best we can tell, of how history changed, evolved from the 4th through the 6th or 7th century. And you could almost argue a number of different places for this change from antiquity to a medieval worldview. So be it. The same problem faces us with the end of the Middle Ages and the beginnings of modernity. When do we call Europe to be early modern? When do we say that now it's early modern as distinct from having been medieval? And there were a number of factors that led to that change. And the biggest factor I will be talking about, in my view, interpretation, and this is the period that I study, is a switch in the, let's say, overarching operational program. You say, what do you mean by operational program? And I would have to say I'm not really sure, to be quite honest, because operational program, as I'm using it here, I'm referring to the minuscule little bits of information, pieces of knowledge and understanding I have of computers. My understanding is that with a computer, there's something called the operative system, whether it is Windows or I know there's a couple of others, but usually often we use Windows. And then there's the programs within that general frame. And in some ways, that's what we're talking about. There was like an operating program for the medieval period, and then there began to be a new one that we call early modern, within which there are all kinds of new programs and different programs being developed, competing programs, and we'll be talking more about that. So often, the Middle Ages are portrayed in the popular mind as the age of faith, when no one thought for themselves, when everyone simply believed what the Pope had to say. Um, and it was only then with the Renaissance and then especially with the Reformation where people started to think for themselves and take back their individuality and to say, here I stand, which Martin Luther never said, but we'll come back to that in the next lecture. Um, and that indicates a new perspective on the world, demarcating beginnings of modernity, i.e., where we recognize people whom we think were more like us today than the people before. Well, that is a very clear reading back into the people, because as we will see too, in the course of this lecture and then next lecture, the Reformation, things were changing during the course of the 16th century, and Europe changed profoundly as a result of the Reformation. But it was not based on individualism. It was not based on a new concept of the self. So often, too, it's been seen as the beginning of toleration and freedom, and that is absolutely not the case. In the lecture to close, I think it's the lecture to close, um, the lecture next week's lecture on the Reformation ends with the end of toleration, because early modern Europe was far less tolerant of individuals, of diversity, than had been the Middle Ages. But we'll come back to that issue. So my whole point in this is to look at some aspects of this operating system of the Middle Ages and some of the various programs within it to give us a basis for then evaluating and recognizing what was different and what can only be referred to as early modern. And I'll be portraying this as a switch in operating systems, whereby the operating system for the Middle Ages can be termed the myth of Christendom, whereas the operating system for early modernity and for much of modernity as such can be termed the myth of the nation state. Now, by myth, I do not mean that which is false. I think I may have addressed this somewhat in the opening lecture, and if not, I probably should have. Myth, in this sense, as I'm using it here, expresses a reality, a truth, even if it's not a scientific, quote unquote, objective truth that can be placed on the table and dissected and analyzed. And we'll see this as we go along as I attempt to describe in very brief terms, whether you realize that it's brief or not, or whether it seems brief to you. Believe me, it is brief from where I'm standing. This myth of Christendom, what did it consist of? How was it constructed? And then when we start seeing the shift to the myth of the state, the early modern nation state, that did begin to take place in the course of the 16th century, which we'll be talking a lot more about in next week's lecture, the Reformation, and the lecture thereafter on the myth of the state, I think is the title for that lecture in week 3, which focuses on the age of absolutism in the 17th and on into the 18th century, before the age of revolutions, in the grand sweep of things. So that kind of sets the stage, I hope, and gives us a point of departure for looking at and addressing early modern Europe beginning next week. So here, to continue what it is we are doing, lecture in part 2, so to speak, is the crumbling of Christendom. Because Christendom was this myth of the medieval period. So what do we mean by the myth of Christendom? Well, and this is slide 2 now on the PowerPoint if you're following along at all. I've already mentioned that these myths I'm talking about are like operating systems. At least for me, since I'm not a computer person, I don't know much of anything about my operating system. I know that, I used to use DOS way back when I first started with computers. And probably unless you are a computer person, you don't really know too much about what DOS is or something like that. I don't know. I'm not even sure enough to know what the terms refer to that I'm speaking about. But I hope that the importance or the image works or fits. That operating system is not something that is really there. Now, obviously, other computer operating systems are really there, but it is an overarching structure. And in many ways, I have compared or can compare Christendom to a family. Most families are not perfect. There may be some that are, but most, there are conflicts. Brothers fighting with brothers, brothers fighting with sisters, even in quote unquote loving families. There's still diversity, there's still conflict, there's still issues. Not everyone within a family thinks and feels the same way. Parents don't think the same way as their children. The children don't think the same way as their parents. They both think each other is very weird and strange. And I don't think I need to belabor the point too much with that. But yet there still is this sense of family of some sort. And I have known brothers. Well, I did not have a brother growing up, but I knew people who did, who fought constantly and pretty violently so with each other. But as soon as someone else attacked one of them, they were very much together over against those people who were not part of the family. The sense of family identity, family belonging, does not mean uniformity. It did not mean that no one had problems and issues, conflicts, disagreements. Does not mean that everyone was the same in any way, shape, or form. There are the black sheep of the family in a broader sense of a broader family that the rest of the family didn't really want to talk about too much, but they recognized that they were family somehow. Now, if that analogy helps, and I think it does, that's what I mean by the operative system, whereby the family is the operative system of for the family, even though there's all kinds of conflicts and differences all mixed in together. And if we can grasp that part of it, we can begin to see that medieval Christendom functioned like a family. It was something that was referred to, and it actually kind of goes back to Charlemagne in the late 8th and 9th century at his court. We find the real emergence of this concept whereby the term Christianity, Christianitas, in Latin, referred to a specific people, the Christian people. It referred to a geopolitical entity rather than a set of beliefs. Christendom was the geographical territory in which Christian worship held sway. Now, in that sense, if we want to talk about the Christian Middle Ages, we can talk about it in that sense. We cannot talk about it in terms of what people believed or what they said or what they did or what they practiced. That's a completely different issue. Christendom, geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship, was ever expanding, or at least for a while it was expanding. Charlemagne conquered the Saxons up in the north and then imposed Christianity on them by fiat. And if you want to know more about this, again, take my early medieval course because we talk a lot about this in there. But it was this overarching structure. Scholars at his court in the late 8th, early 9th century started talking about Christianitas. And so when we find Christianitas in the Christian empire, Regnum Christianum, the Christian empire, the Christian kingdom sovereignty, we should translate it as Christendom rather than as Christianity, because Christianity as a doctrine of faith or set of doctrines of faith, whatever you want to call it, was distinct from how they viewed themselves as being part of Christendom. And it was Christendom that went to war against the Turks, against Islam in the Crusades in the late 11th century and on through the 12th and 13th century, or 13th and 14th centuries. And so it's a different concept than what we're used to. And this idea that everyone in the Middle Ages just thought the same and believed the same and did not think for themselves is absolutely not the case when we look at the historical record. Did everyone believe Christianity? Well, the Jews did not, and there were Jews within Christendom. They were, after the period of the Crusades in the late 11th century, in the wake of the Crusades, part of that movement, they became increasingly persecuted. The first pogroms in Europe came as crusaders were making their way to the Holy Land to fight the infidel. The idea was like, why are we going all the way to the Middle East, to Jerusalem, to fight the infidel when we have the infidel right here with the Jews? So there were pogroms. Jews were forced to start to live in ghettos and were distinguishing marks for a while. There was always a very tense relationship between the Jews in Europe and the rest of European society. The popes were very supportive of the Jews and tried to defend the Jews. The Jews served as the Pope's bankers, and we could talk a lot about that. The point is, it's a very complex, tense relationship. But I'm getting back to the issue of what did it mean to be Christian? Because throughout most of this period, being Christian meant you were baptized and you attended Christian worship. That's about all it meant. It did not mean you acted a certain way, did not mean you believed certain things. I could go on at length about this. But that was simply the basis for what it meant. In the 12th century, there begins to be a movement by scholars, by preachers to say, you know what, now that we're all Christian, we have to start teaching people actually what it means to be Christian and how to live a Christian life. I'll be talking more about that as we go along too a bit. But there was not a unified understanding of what that actually entailed. So that we can't say that everyone believed the same things about almost anything in the Middle Ages. Yes, most people in the Middle Ages believed in God. They believed in heaven and hell. And they believed that being Christian, however what that might mean, was the way to get to heaven and to escape going to hell, because no one wants to go to hell. So that's the basic doctrine of Christianity. Yes, but it also was a doctrine of antiquity, this idea of an afterlife of bliss or of punishment. In some ways, we can trace it all the way back to Plato's Republic at the end with the myth of Plato didn't believe that there was a such thing, but he said it's the way to get people to conform. It's a way to have people be good citizens, because that is our goal. If we tell them that if they if they don't contribute to society as they should, they're going to end up in kind of eternal torment and punishment. Whereas if they are, after they die, they'll have a pretty nice time of it. Now, that dualistic concept of heaven and hell, however they're called, whether it's the Elysian fields and Hades or Christian heaven and hell, was a far broader concept in the development of human culture in the West than Christianity. Christianity kind of takes it over, adopts it, makes it its own. It's also there in the Jewish tradition. Sheol, don't let your soul end up in Sheol, as opposed to the bosom of Abraham and things like that. And so most people believe that. Now, when I say most people believe that, I have no way of making that statement based on any understanding that is actual. I can't prove that. Because that's one of the problems in history, which I know pretty sure I did talk about in the first lecture. We can only say things about the past based on the extant sources. And we do not have any sources in the medieval period that pointed out that people did not believe in heaven and hell or in God. We have sources certainly that pointed to people who did not believe the way those in power believed, the heretics as they were then deemed, those who believed wrongly. We know about some of those groups, but we don't know anyone who said, this is all hooey. And we'll be talking a little bit about this when we get to the later lectures in terms of the 17th and on into the 18th century with the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. It was only till the end of the 17th century before atheism became to be a term of self-designation, before someone would say, yes, I'm an atheist. The term was around before. People used it as a term of accusation and denigration. You're an atheist. For the Romans, the Christians, the early Christians were seen as atheists. They were called, they're atheists. And you say, well, why? What? Well, very simple from a good Romans perspective. They didn't believe in the gods. They only had one God. They didn't believe in the gods. They were atheos. They were without the gods. So it is an accepted view, since there are no sources that are extant to give us any indication otherwise, that during the Middle Ages, we have three basic religions interacting at times in various ways. We have Christianity in Europe, Judaism in Europe, and Islam in the East, and Judaism in the East. So the boundaries of Europe and Christendom were forged over against Islam, and then, of course, the Atlantic and Africa. And we'll be talking about those expansions later on today. Now, that's what I'm trying to get at with this myth of Christendom as the operative system. Within that, though, there is all types of diversity. And here I am abbreviating greatly. The first point then on this slide, the myth of Christendom, is feudal society. There's been a lot of debate about feudalism, because feudalism, as a term, as a 19th century German term, as most isms, if not all isms, and describes a whole series of phenomena. And then we start taking that descriptive term as historical reality. Feudal is an historical term. It comes from the Latin word feudum, F-E-U-D-U-M, which referred to the grant of land that the lord would give to a vassal. The feudum, technically, was defined as the amount of land necessary to support one knight. One knight being defined as a mounted warrior. Again, I go into this in far more detail in my full-length semester classes on Europe in the early Middle Ages, or Europe in the high and later Middle Ages. Just to give the sense that this concept is not uniform either, but it is based on a reciprocal relationship between someone who had territory and granted it out to others for their use to provide service to the Lord. It's Lord and vassal, and on we go. And then the top of that hierarchy was seen as the king. Now, in my full-on classes, and often, if we had a little bit more time, I'd be in the first semester of this course. I'd go into a bit more detail here. Feudalism is an easy structure to understand, or relatively so, when we see it top down. The king granting land to his nobles, who grant land to sub-nobles or lower-level nobles, all the way down to then the manor and the peasants who work the manor. But it all developed from the bottom up, so to speak. So it becomes very difficult to see how it all develops, and it developed in different ways in different places. Feudalism in England is very different from feudalism in France, and the empire, which I'll come back to, was a whole other issue. So within that structure, it's based on reciprocity, responsibility, mutual working together of lords and vassals. And then there are the peasants. Legally in the 12th century, again, this is codifying developments that were more complex, but then trying to come up with a legal structure to describe what happened. Scholars in the 12th century said that there are three orders of society, of people, three types of people, categories. There are those who fight, or the nobility, part of the definition. Those who pray, or the clergy, hierarchy throughout. And those who work, or the peasants. Now, these three orders of society describe, to a large extent, the social structures of society, but not completely in any way, shape, or form. Because what they mean is if you were not noble, which is based on land ownership and inheritance and blood, if you were not a noble and you weren't a priest or part of the clergy, you were a peasant by definition. So what do we do with merchants? And there's the rise of trade and commerce beginning in the 11th century, the rise of towns. So all of a sudden you have an influx of people living in increasingly populated cities who are merchants, who are craftspeople. They're not peasants as we think of as peasants, but they're not nobles. They're not members of the clergy. Where do they fit in? And there was huge tension there between the social reality and then the legal structures. And these legal structures of these three orders continued far after the Reformation, to the point that one great medievalist, Jacques Le Goff, a French medievalist who's now dead, but wrote a very insightful essay called The Long Middle Ages, where he argued that the Middle Ages didn't really end until the French Revolution. So 1789, we'll be getting to the French Revolution, the problems involved there later on in this course. But why would he argue that? Because obviously things had changed. A lot had changed between, let's say, 1750 and 1250, certainly. And Le Goff is not claiming that they weren't. But what his point was this threefold structuring of society legally did continue until the French Revolution, number one. And number two, for the vast majority of people throughout the Middle Ages on until the later 18th century, which we'll be getting to, their economy was based on agriculture. And actually, most of the economy and wealth was based on agriculture. And the vast majority of people's lives were not that much different in 1700 than they were in 1200. For the scholars, for the nobles, for the clergy, they were. But for the common people, the vast majority of the population, from whom we have almost no sources, we're beginning to later on, what we know about them, we know from archaeological excavation, we know about them from sources written by the quote-unquote elites, the educated, the clergy, the nobility. So we know what they were said about them, but we have very few sources telling us how they viewed the world and what they thought and what they wanted. We'll be talking about some of that. You'll be reading one of the big documents about a peasant uprising, the Peasant War in 1525, for next week. But Le Goff's point is that for the majority of the population, life didn't change much until after the revolutions, meaning the French Revolution and then the Industrial Revolution, and on we go. And then whether or not that was a change for the better is a whole other question, but we'll be getting back to those issues. And we'll be getting back to the French Revolution, but what do I say here? Because these three orders in medieval society, nobility, clergy, peasants, or nobility, clergy, everybody else, was the legal structure of the French government, the Estates General, the Parliament or the Congress, whatever you want to call it, of France, which was a medieval institution, representative government to a degree. The King of France was responsible for calling the Estates General and did it several times. It wasn't a standing body, it was there to support the king. And the problem was, though, that the Estates General voted by a state, as it was called in France, in French, and the French translation of ordo in Latin was état, a state, a state. But the three estates, what were the three estates? They were the nobility, the clergy, and everybody else, the peasants. And it had been that within the Estates General, the assembly, the legislative body of France, each estate had a single vote. So if there was an issue of do we go to war, well, let's take a vote. Well, you have the nobility with one vote, you have the clergy with one vote, and everybody else gets one vote. In the French Revolution, as we will see when we get there, that structure was overthrown, and some members of the clergy of the Second Estate, as it was called, joined together with members of the Third Estate, quote unquote, the peasants, but they represented everyone else, and by this time, increasingly very wealthy merchants and anyone who wasn't just, by definition, either noble by blood or part of the clergy, to overturn this entire structure, to say, we should have some sort of voting based on population, not based on status of order. So that is kind of what Le Goff's argument was. That based on, at least in France, this concept of the three orders that had arisen in the 12th century and continued on until the French Revolution, where society structurally changed. And we'll be looking more at that as we go. So when we talk about feudal society, it's not simply medieval at all, but this is the origins of medieval government that continued in some ways, even though with transformations and alterations, until the emergence of modernity, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and on we go. Within this construct, in France, even with the Estates General, we have an emerging strong central monarchy in France. The King of France viewed himself as directly ruling for God, and on we go. In England, we have emerging a strong centralized monarchy with the King of England, and then from the 12th century on with Parliament, which again a representative body, just like the Estates General, serve the king, but also a feudal monarch in that general sense. And then we have what's called the Empire. And this goes back to Charlemagne and the so-called fall of Rome to grasp this. Charlemagne was crowned on Christmas Day 800 by the Pope, the Roman Emperor. Now there is a lot of developments behind that. But as I said, just when did Rome fall? And I said for Clovis, the king of the Franks, Rome never fell. Rome hadn't fallen for anyone because the Roman emperor was still in the east. To make a very long story short, in the later 8th century, there was a conflict between the Pope and the Archbishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople in the east, the Roman Emperor in the east, over some doctrinal positions, iconoclasm and some other things. Oh, it's a long story there too. To the point where the Pope in the West thought, you know what? They've fallen into heresy. That's how far they've gone. Fallen into wrong teaching. Now, it was a given that a heretic could not be emperor because the emperor was Christian. After all, going all the way back to the late 4th century, Emperor Theodosius, before any speaking of the fall of Rome, proclaimed Christianity the only legal religion of Rome. So to be Roman emperor meant to be Christian. Didn't mean that you behaved a certain way or necessarily believed a certain way. But it was inconceivable. It'd be like saying that we have a communist for president. Now, that is certainly not a political statement on my part, because we don't. But it would be a contradiction in terms for us in the United States to have a communist as president. Leaving aside the political issues and the difference between communism and socialism and the horrible misuse of the term socialism as it's bantered about today, and socialist and all those things. But the point being here is that there was seen as an imperial vacancy. Because if the emperor falls into heresy, they are therefore no longer emperor by that very fact. So all of a sudden, Europe was once again without an emperor. Now, this was seen as the continuation of the Roman Empire. Because at the time, there was never a fall of Rome. The Roman Empire just continued. It just kind of shifted. It shifted from the Latins then to the Greeks. But the emperor and the empire remained. And so when the Pope crowned Charlemagne in 800, he crowned Charlemagne as Roman emperor to restore the office, because there was a vacancy because the emperor in the East had fallen into heresy. So he was just bringing back, let's say, the seat of government, the capital of the empire, the Roman Empire, back to Charlemagne in the West. It got very complicated after that, but a little point. When Charlemagne was crowned, he was crowned, as I said, Roman Emperor, not Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor, as a title, did not begin until 961 with the restoration of the emperor in the West. Because after Charlemagne, his empire disintegrated. Which I'll get to in a minute. This is important for understanding what we're talking about here. Charlemagne controlled more territory in Europe, in all of Central Europe, than anybody had since the Romans. Now, what happened when Charlemagne dies in 814? The emperor, his son, became emperor, Louis the Pious. And then Louis the Pious had 3 sons. Actually, he had 4, but that gets into too much detail for us here and now. He had 3 sons. And so when Louis the Pious dies, who gets to be king? Who gets to be emperor? And the 3 sons fought each other very fiercely. A couple of them ganged up against their father, still trying to figure out who was going to get what in terms of the inheritance, who was going to be emperor, and it wasn't clear. And it wasn't clear until they finally came to a settlement after Louis the Pious dies in 843. And in 843, the 3 sons, Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Louis the German, made an agreement. Signed at the city of Verdun. It's called the Treaty of Verdun, which they divided Europe. They divided their fathers and therefore grandfathers' empire between the 3 of them. Charles the Bald got the western part of the empire. Lothar got the central part of the empire and the title emperor. And Louis the German got the eastern part of the empire. And that was that. You say, well, gosh, what, didn't Lothar get the best deal? Not really, because the central part that he got was not that much. It was like northern Italy, going on up to the Netherlands, what's today the Netherlands, Belgium, and the other two sides got the lion's share of those sides. And what became kind of France, Spain was another issue, but it's France and Spain, and then Germany, Poland, Eastern Europe, two large areas. And they were happy to say, okay, fine, Lothar, you can go call yourself emperor. We don't care because we are still descendants directly from Charlemagne, who was the emperor. So actually, we're as good as you are. If you want to call yourself emperor, go ahead. Now, this area of Lothar's territory between France, or what would become France, and Germany, or what would become Germany, was fought over ever since. It's fought over into modern times, World War One, World War Two, the Lorraine, Lotharingia. Lotharingia is the Latin term for the lands of Lothar. The French translation of Lotharingia is the Lorraine, the Alsace-Lorraine, German and French. If you've ever been to, let's say, Strasbourg, which is right in the center, it's a dual language city, French and German, because it kind of went back and forth over the centuries as France and Germany fought over this Lothar's territory. Now, that is important for understanding this concept of the empire, because as we go on from the Treaty of Verdun, after the three, kind of the power decreased. Lothar's title of emperor, there was a big gap in replacing the emperor, and it wasn't until Otto I in 961, and then was crowned in 962, was successfully defeated the Vikings and all those things who were coming in, new invaders, as some of the Turks as well, ongoing problem in Europe. Was re-established as emperor, Otto I, and given the title Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Empire, continued until Napoleon. Napoleon got rid of the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor, for the last time in 1804, but I'll have to check the precise date. But meaning this concept of the Roman Empire continued, and we'll go along and see later on in this course how that idea, what I've referred to in my lectures in Western Civ 1 as the myth of Rome, which then transformed into the myth of Christendom, which then transformed into the myth of the modern state, or the nation state, as an operative system. But that idea of Roman Empire continued, and we'll see how that was so. Why do I say that? Because the emperor developed to the point where in the 12th century, the Holy Roman Emperor, Friedrich Barbarossa, Germanic, certainly, established for the first time since Charlemagne what he called the German Empire. The German Empire. It was the first Reich. Now, this was kind of an empire within an empire because there was a concept still that the old Roman Empire, the emperor was the emperor of all Roman Empire, but by the 12th century, with very strong monarchies in France and in England, it was clear that that wasn't really the case, even if there was some overarching idea that, yeah, it kind of still is, but not really. Well, Frederick Barbarossa wanted to assert his authority, so we are establishing the Reich, the German Empire. That was the first Reich. Bismarck, in 1871, as we'll get to, established the Second Reich, where he unified Germany. Germany was not a thing, did not exist as a political entity until Bismarck, 1871, unifying Germany. The German peoples, the German-speaking peoples was there. Even the concept, we'll maybe see, depending on how far we get with Luther, wrote to the Christian nobility of the German nation. The idea of the Germans was there, but not of Germany until Bismarck, 1871, when he established the German Empire. The second time, the Zweite Reich. That's fine. And then we have, with Hitler, the Third Reich. And what that Third Reich is the third instantiation of the German Empire of Frederick Barbarossa, which was the reestablishment of the Roman Empire. It all fits together. One of the interesting things, too, about the Reich, I said there's no such thing as Germany, and there wasn't. It was a conglomeration of independent kingdoms and states. And so who got to be emperor? Well, often it was simply the heir of the previous emperor. So we talk about the dynasties, the Saxon dynasty of emperors, beginning with Otto I. We have the Hohenstaufen in the 12th century, and on we go. But the point being is that is the practical function, but the theoretical function was all the German princes. All the German princes would elect the emperor. The emperor was an elected office. And you can probably see, gosh, it must be kind of hard. I mean, in France and in England, it's kind of clear. Your firstborn male son is going to be the heir to the throne. And there was a whole order of succession, who was going to succeed, and on we go. But in the empire, that was not so clear, because they had to be voted on, elected. But then there becomes a problem, who has the right to vote for the elector? It was only in 1354, with the Golden Bull of 1354, the Emperor Charles IV established 7 electors. He said, okay, the 7 largest princes within the empire will be the electors. I just want to run through who these were, because it will be important for what comes later, too. We have the King of Bohemia. We have the Duke of Bavaria. We have the Count Palatinate. And we have the King of, oh my gosh, Eric. Count Palatinate, Duke of Bavaria, King of Bohemia, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Sorry, Margrave of Brandenburg, in the eastern part, Poland, actually. So those 4, a Margrave, a Duke, a Count, and a King. And then the archbishops of Trier, Cologne, and Mainz. Archbishops throughout the Middle Ages and on into early modern Europe, and bishops as such, were not simply holy people in any way, shape, or form, and most of them were not holy whatsoever. It was an office. It was a dignity, an issue of nobility, and it was almost indistinguishable from the so-called secular princes. So we have 3 archbishops, 4 secular princes to elect the emperor, and that will become very important for understanding what really happened in the so-called Reformation when we get there. The point I want to make here, so we'll be coming back to that, but that's something that you need to know for understanding what's going forward. This feudal society was rather diverse. The structures of the British monarchy were different from the structures of the French monarchy, and it was very different from the elected office of the emperor. Now, funny thing about it, the clergy, the Pope, the archbishops, the priests, the diocese, also, the Pope was also an elected official. Talk a lot about the development of this and how a diocese, which is presided over by a bishop, was actually a Roman term. When Roman administrative power in the West kind of fell by the wayside in the 5th century and 6th century, what was left was the ecclesiastical structure, so that a bishop was the territorial ruler of a diocese. A diocese was a Roman administrative division established by Diocletian in the early 4th century. So we see it all kind of coming together, how a bishop, and then consequently archbishop as well, is not only a spiritual ruler, he was also a temporal ruler over a diocese. And there is real tension between the so-called spiritual princes, and they're called prince bishops, and the secular bishops. And when I say secular, I certainly do not mean not unchristian. Secular at this time meant not part of the clergy. So we have the regular clergy and we have the secular clergy. And bishops, for the most part, were secular clergy, but sometimes they were regular clergy as well, namely members of monastic orders. So we have a power struggle. Because with all this diversity, who speaks for Christendom? Who is the patriarch of the family? Going back to the family analogy or the operating system analogy. Is it the Pope or is it the Emperor? Both the Pope and the Emperor believe that they rule directly for God. You see, now I'm moving on to point 2 of the first slide. And I know we're not going to get through all of this. What I may need to do is when I finish this slide, maybe come to a stopping point, try to get it posted, and we'll continue with a part 3. I told you it was going to be hard for me to hold back. But these are important things to grasp and understand if we're going to have any understanding really of what happens in the Reformation and what makes early modern Europe distinct and different. So let's look at some of this Pope-Emperor conflict. So much for an age of faith. Popes and emperors, princes and popes, princes and bishops, constantly were struggling over power and authority and control. The idea that everybody just said, oh yes, kind of like the in Star Wars, Emperor Strikes Back with C-3PO and those wonderful furry little things. I forget what they were called. And they thought he was a god, and they were like, as you know, C-3PO is sitting there. So often that is the image of the Middle Ages with respect to the Pope, and that is absolutely not the case. Emperors would fight with popes, popes would fight with emperors, and give all kinds of examples of this. Princes would fight with emperors, and princes would fight with popes, and princes would fight with bishops. And there are a number of very famous ones. I won't go through all of those, or any of them really, but I want you to know that this idea that there was uniformity is completely false. And popes would excommunicate emperors, and emperors would depose popes or try to. And they didn't really care that much because if you're emperor, you know that you are ruling for God. If you are pope, you know that you are ruling for God. And the problem is, well, God wants you to do what I say. No, God wants you to do what I say. And of course, we can't bring God down to say, God, what do you pick? What's going on here? The problem is kings, King of France, in any case, felt that he was an emperor within his own realm and that he too ruled directly for God. So when we have a major conflict in the early 14th century between the King of France and the Pope, it's like the King of France says, who are you to tell me what to do? We'll see later on too, which I will go into more detail about. But in the early 16th century, the emperor goes to war with the Pope. The Pope goes to war with the Emperor and had for quite a long time. In the 14th century, Pope John XXII went to war with Louis of Bavaria. It's been estimated that Pope John spent 2/3 of his income approximately on mercenaries to fight Louis. Louis deposed John, proclaimed him a heretic, and established a new pope. In his view, didn't really last very long. So there's all these conflicts all over the place. It was a struggle for power within this idea of Christendom because the struggle was who has the final say, who speaks for the family. Some ways we can say, okay, if you're I don't know if any of you are Soprano fans or were fans of the series of The Sopranos. Who was the head of the family? That was a problem with The Sopranos a bit, because Tony was, but then there was Junior. And what do we do about all this? So the same thing within Christendom. I don't mean to imply that Christendom was simply a mob family or a series of mobsters in the five families or whatever. But there are some similarities because it is both our hierarchical structures, the papacy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and then the political, or I shouldn't say political, but the secular hierarchy of emperor. And how do they fit together? What are the ideas and the themes? And it became very difficult. The imperial view, meaning the side of the emperor and then the secular princes, the kings of France, the king of England by and large, we'll get back to that too, viewed that they were ruling directly from God and that the clergy should serve them. Certainly, Christianity is absolutely needed and necessary. And let's listen to what they have to say. Let's follow their advice. Obviously, we need the clergy for salvation. We can ask them to absolve us. We go to confession. We partake of the sacraments. The clergy is absolutely essential. But when it comes to both domestic and international affairs, you don't need a priest to tell me how to run my country or how to run my my fief or my kingdom or my dukedom or my county or duchy. Certainly, if I'm king of France, I don't want to be told what I can and can't do. Can I go to war with England or can I not? There's a real problem there. And in one way, part of this conflict can be seen in the early 12th century with King John of England and Philip II, King of France. King John and Philip II were at loggerheads because King John was claiming actually that he should be King of France, not Philip. It was a succession controversy and over inheritance and family lineage and the whole bit. And John started preparing to go to war with Philip. What do we do about this? Well, the Pope first said, John, you can't do that. I'm going to excommunicate you. John said, that's not right. I don't really care, blah, 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 blah. It came very close to breaking from the Pope officially. But as his fortunes turned out not being so great in terms of his battles with Philip, he thought, God, I'm really in a hard place. What do I do? He said, well, maybe I should make up with the Pope. Because the Pope was supporting Philip II of France against John, whom he had excommunicated. So naturally he would. But John said, if I can make up with the Pope, maybe the Pope will back off supporting Philip and we can come to some kind of a solution. So that's what he did. He said, hey, Pope, tell you what I'll do. I'll make a deal with you. If you will absolve me, forgive me, back off of supporting Philip and tell Philip to leave me alone, I will give you England as a fief. I will give you England that I will hold as a fief from you. So the Pope said, that sounds a pretty good deal to me. He said, okay. So the Pope then tells Philip, you got to back off. So, what? You got to be kidding. Come on. Now, the English nobles got really upset at John. Well, you just gave away our whole country to the Pope so that you are simply a vassal of the Pope? How dare you? And that was one of the factors that led to the Magna Carta. That's a document that you've heard of or not. But that's how some Pope would kind of interact. And the whole point with that was that the Pope does have control over sin and over salvation and absolution. It's a spiritual power. It was recognized that the Pope had authority in the cases of sin. But then what is sin? Sin could be almost anything. And when it was seen as a sin for one Christian prince to attack another, then the Pope would say, if you do that, Philip, anymore, you are then sinning, and that means you're going to be going to hell. Now, that can be very powerful. As I said before, even though there was no such thing as uniformity of belief, no kowtowing to the Pope as such, people did believe in heaven and hell, and did believe that the clergy had some effect on how they would get to heaven or hell. If they were not forgiven of their sins, they knew they weren't going to heaven. So that in case of sin became widely broadened to include also very clearly temporal things. Now, there's conflict remained with this, and I'll come back to this later on, but in the 14th century, we continued to have conflict between the Pope and the Emperor. And one scholar, writing on behalf of the Emperor, Marsilius of Padua, wrote this amazing treatise called The Defender of the Peace, Defensor Pacis, and claiming that the Emperor was sovereign and that the papacy actually should be abolished. We need the clergy. The empire, a state, needs the clergy just like they need any other function of the state. Like we need garbage collectors, we need the military, we need teachers to teach our children. We also need clergy. But every priest is equal, and we don't need a pope. And if there's any kind of hierarchy within the church, it's simply a human structure that humans have established, and so the emperor, as the head of the secular, can remove that. And that's what we actually should do to preserve the peace. Let's get rid of the emperor, because the whole problems we've been having is because of the pope trying to affect and influence and determine the affairs of state, so to speak. That was 1324. Didn't have much impact at first. Lewis loved it. Talk a lot about that whole aspect. I've written a fair amount about it. But it would come back to have major importance and significance in the 16th century with King Henry VIII. But that would be something I'd come back to. But keep that in mind. Marsilius of Padua, Defender of the Faith, 1324. Because I'll be referring back to it when I talk about Henry VIII and the English Reformation. Definitely a medieval treatise. That was one of the options that was there, part of this extreme struggle between the Pope and the Emperor on a theoretical basis as well as on a practical basis. And at the same time, writing against Marsilius, writing for the Pope, was an Augustinian hermit, Augustinus of Ancona, who wrote his summation of ecclesiastical power, or a comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical power, written for Pope John the 22nd, over against Louis of Bavaria, and responding implicitly to Marsilius. And here we find Augustinus arguing that the Pope had basically absolute authority. And when I talk about the beginnings of absolutism, we really find the origins of absolutism in the medieval papacy. But that's something, too, we'll come back to. And that's just to show the diversity of positions that were there. So, where are we now? I'm still with the myth of Christendom. We've done clerical and lay power, Pope and Emperor, and what this all is about and getting to is this idea of unity and diversity. That's the third thing. Within Christendom, there was a unity, like there's a family unity. But within that unity, there was a lot of diversity of structures, diversity of theoretical opinions, philosophical opinions, theological opinions, which we can't touch much upon at this point. A wide variety that was accepted and welcomed within this idea of unity. Did the popes want everybody to believe what they said? Of course they did. Just like I would like all of you to believe everything I say. I would like my sons to believe everything I tell them, to not only to believe what I tell them, but actually to do exactly what I tell them. That would make things much easier, nicer. It would be hell for them. Diversity and unity can go together if the tension can be handled, because there will always be tension. And there was a lot of tension and conflict within medieval Christendom, even with this overarching concept of unity over against the common enemy, the infidel, the Turk coming from outside. That was a problem for the West, for Christendom, from the time of the Crusades, the late 11th century, on through the beginnings of the 16th century, right as the Reformation was coming about. I'll talk more about that when we get there. Now, I haven't even gotten very far on this. I have another slide, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Um, and I think what I'll do now is take a pause and a stop, and then try to add a third part to this first lecture, which will cover the next slides, which should be able to do get us on our way. But this is all very important background, I feel, not only for early modern Europe, but also for the Reformation, which will be the next lecture, next week, even though part 3 of lecture 1 will be coming up. To help us see how things change, because these structures of the empire, France, England, papal imperial conflict are all very important to see how things